Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Corbett, the Deputy Editor of ArtNet News, and I'm very happy to be here to kick off the first installment of ArtNet Talks, our new series of live virtual conversations where we host leading figures in the art world to talk through the most pressing issues of the day. For our first talk, Art as an Act of Resistance, I'm going to actually step back and give the floor to three artists, Shaun Leonardo, Clifford Owens, and Dred Scott, whose bios I'll read in a minute and then I'll let them take it away. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, you can type them into the box at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Not the one that says chat box, if you see that as well, but the Q&A one. And this is also being recorded, so it'll be available later if you want to watch it again, or if you know people who weren't able to make it tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. Clifford Owens is a transdisciplinary artist. He makes photographs, performance art, works on paper, videos, installations, and texts. His art has appeared in many solo and group exhibitions. Owens' solo museum exhibitions include Anthology at MoMA PS1, Better the Rebel You Know at Home in Manchester, England, and Perspective 173 Clifford Owens at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston. His performance-based projects have been widely presented in museums and galleries, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Shaun Leonardo's multidisciplinary work negotiates societal expectations of manhood, namely definitions surrounding Black and brown masculinities, along with its notions of achievement, collective identity, and experience of failure. His performance practice, anchored by his work in Assembly, a diversion program for court-involved youth at the nonprofit Recess, is participatory and invested in a process of embodiment. He's a Brooklyn-based artist from Queens, New York. He received his MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute, is a recipient of support from Creative Capital, Guggenheim Social Practice, Art for Justice, and A Blade of Grass. His work has been featured at the Guggenheim Museum, the High Line, and New Museum, with the recent solo exhibition at the Maryland Institute College of Art. From the fall of 2018 through spring 2020, he enacted socially engaged projects at Pratt Institute's School of Art. Dred Scott is an interdisciplinary artist whose art encourages viewers to re-examine ideals of American society. In 1989, the US Senate outlawed his artwork and President Bush declared it disgraceful because of its transgressive use of the American flag. His work has been exhibited at the Whitney Museum, MoMA PS1, the Walker Art Center, and in galleries and on street corners. He's a 2019 Open Society Foundation's Soros Equality Fellow, and he's received grants from United States Artists and the Creative Capital Foundation. ArtNet News highlighted his 2019 performance, Slave Rebellion Reenactment, as one of the most important artworks of the decade. So I will now turn it over to Clifford Owens.
Clifford, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me initially to write an essay about performance art and activism, given what's going on in the culture in the country right now. And so, as I always do, or often do in my practice, I wanted to expand the conversation to include other artists in that conversation. So I asked, and fortunately they allowed this conversation to happen with Dred and Scott, Dred Scott and Shaun Leonardo, two very good friends of mine over many years. We've both collaborated with both on performance-based projects in the past and hope to do so in the future. Of course, my invitation is intentional in terms of inviting two Black American artist men. So what we're going to do is break this up into constituent parts. Shaun and Dred will both present 5-minute presentations. I will as well. And then we're going to take about 30 minutes to unpack a number of questions that I've prepared for this virtual conversation. And those rubrics are performance art, politics, and protest, filming the police, censorship, and community. So I think that I will start. Is that right? I start the presentation. Let's go to my screen. This is a photograph. The title of this work is Photographs with an Audience, San Antonio, Loving Black Men in Public, from 2018. This project, Photographs with an Audience, began in 2008 when Barack Obama poised to become the first elected African-American president of the United States. And since then has charted photographically and performatively many transitions in culture and many political moments. The title for this performance-based project, this particular one in San Antonio, happened while I was on residence at Art Pace. And I was thinking about many things as a Black American man in San Antonio, Texas, at that particular time. And one thing I was thinking about was this quote from Cornel West, quote, "Justice is what love looks like in public." And I began to think, what does it look like? What does it mean to love Black men in public? Now, perhaps this prompt should have followed this line of thought. What does it mean to love Black trans and cis men in public? What does it mean to love Black men in public? What does loving Black men look like in public? What does it mean when 3 Black men artists come together in a virtual space to have a conversation about what it looks like to love a Black man in public? George Floyd needed someone to love him in public when he pleaded for a cool drink of water. What does it mean to love a Black man in public? Okay, so I'm done with that.
Cliff, would you like me to go next?
Yes, please, Dred, thanks. Or Shaun or Dred.
Either way.
Okay.
Shaun.
I'll go, Dred.
Okay.
I just want to take a moment and say that I'm humbled by the amount of people that are here witnessing this moment, and also in recognition of a lot of the names here. So I'm going to go quickly because, like Cliff said, I'm much more intrigued by the Q&A and what we might share together. And so I'm going to give a brief history of my work and how we arrived at this moment. And I know there are many people on this line very aware of the visibility specifically around part of my practice, but also around my identity and the ways in which I negotiate my relationships with institutions. And so I will then start with my ongoing practice, navigating, instigating, but also collaborating with the justice system. For the last now over 4 years, I have acted as co-founder and lead educator for a diversion program entitled Assembly, hosted and held with care by the organization Recess, the nonprofit art space, also based in Brooklyn. And to go through the nuts and bolts rather quickly, essentially what this entails is that youth 18 to 25 who have been arrested in Brooklyn and brought to the downtown criminal court, both misdemeanor charges and as of recently also felony charges, rather than have their case pursued in court, they can join me for a 4-week cycle of performance-based workshops in which we investigate and explore their experiences of arrest and incarceration, the way they've internalized those messages of criminalization from a young age, with the goal of undoing the ways that they've already started to perceive themselves as criminal. The objective has always been and will continue to always be to restore some sense of humanity in how they see themselves, because it is my position that no reform, no legislation that can be enacted to reform the system, to reform policing, will ever do the work of allowing young people to live fully and experience the joy that they deserve. And so my investment, and I should back up by saying that after the 4-week cycle, their cases can be closed and their records sealed so that they avoid an adult record that can follow them for the rest of their lives, interrupting their possibilities of housing, schooling, employment, and so much more. But my investment and the investment of Recess goes well beyond one case, because we all know, or at least we should know, that we, Black men, young men and women, have an ongoing relationship with law enforcement well beyond one case. And so if we do not do the job of catering to their lives, then we aren't doing anything. And so the images that you're seeing are not of the workshop process, because that is conducted anonymously. Instead, you're seeing an early iteration of one of the many public programs that some of our young people have committed to, because I should explain that Recess takes a rather radical stance in this work, in that anyone that goes, or I should say, as I call it, graduates through the court mandated cycle, can self-select and return and be part of a longer engagement and be paid for their creative practice. Working alongside artists, working as mentors, and co-leading workshops with me for other youth. And so the images that you're seeing are of one of the public programs in which the youth have invited members of the audience to craft the tableaus of their experience with law enforcement, essentially creating the space to embody their memories. My practice has always been anchored in this work, or has at least been in the last few years, but I want to trace it back to earlier practice, this being I Can't Breathe, which really dominated my performance work for 4 years following the killing of Eric Garner. It was a performance in which I invited participants into what they believed to be a self-defense workshop. And over the course of 30 or 40 minutes, what they learned with a stranger would take on the weight of police violence, culminating in the maneuver that the NYPD still refuses to call a chokehold, and the impossibility of Eric Garner escaping that maneuver. The eulogy, a funeral procession in the style of a New Orleans jazz funeral procession, commemorating and memorializing the lives of young men of color who have been killed by the police, using the eulogy at the center of Ralph Ellis's The Invisible Man. I think I mentioned names possibly 14 times, and it was far too easy to fill those names. And finally, as an extension of the assembly practice, a project called Primitive Games, in which I invited, in this iteration, military veterans, the NYPD, a group that I coined Citizens Impacted by Street Violence, and a final group of firearm enthusiasts to debate one another, but without the use of words, thanks to the Guggenheim Social Practice Initiative. And I did want to take a moment to tie this work to much of the drawings that are at the center of protest right now, or I should say the center of controversy, which led to the censorship of my practice, the censorship of an exhibition that was intended to open up just a week ago at the MoCA the Museum of Contemporary Art, Cleveland. This you're seeing a drawing of Eric Garner's killing, Stefan Clark, and finally 3 drawings utilizing mirrored tint, forcing a viewer to implicate themselves within the violence and aggression of these abstracted officers. These 3 drawings referring to the death of a young man who was killed by the police in my own neighborhood when I was a child, and of which there is no visual evidence. And what's important for me to share here is that my drawing practice and my performance practice, I approach them both with the same strategies. I approach them both with the same integrity, and I approach them both with the same objectives of situating ourselves in pain and trauma to learn from it differently, and to see more slowly, to feel more slowly, and to be able to lodge information, to dislodge a headline that would otherwise only exist in our minds through rational thought and place it somewhere else in our body, so we have to contend with it differently. On to you, Brother Dred.
Okay. Yeah. So let me just share a screen and then we will. Okay, so as you know, like my other 2 colleagues, I work in a lot of different media, and while a lot of the emphasis of the talk and discussion tonight is over, you know, we'll highlight and touch on performance and police, it is important to actually give a broad sense of some of what I do, and so I do want to show a couple projects which were referred to. Rachel referred to them at the beginning. This is a piece called "What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag?" It's an installation for audience participation. So this is one of the kind of works that I do that shows in galleries and museums. It was made in 1988, and it consists of a photo montage that has a text that says, "What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag?" I'll show you a detail of that in a second. Below that are books that were originally blank that people could write responses to that question in, and below that is a 3 by 5 foot flag that people have the option of standing on as they write their responses. This is a detail of the photo montage, and as you can see, it has the text which I referred to. Also, it has images of South Korean students burning American flags, holding signs that say, "Yankee, go home, son of a bitch." And below that are flag-draped coffins draped in an American flag coming back from Vietnam in a troop transport. It wasn't just my views of the flag. This was really an installation for audience participation. People wrote lots and lots and lots in the books. There were some short answers, some long answers, some drawings in multiple languages. We don't have time to go into all of that, but nonetheless, this was a vigorously debated and engaged artwork. When it was first shown, well, actually the second showing, when it was shown at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago when I was an undergraduate student in 1989. This is a demonstration of almost all white, almost all Korean War and World War II veterans calling for the removal of the work from the School of the Art Institute, which is attached to the Art Institute, which this is a picture of. And they chanted things like "the flag and the artist, hang them both high," bringing back images of lynching. And it got to the point where George Bush 1 called the work disgraceful, and Congress actually outlawed it, which was very significant. And it really showed me the power of art. You know, had you asked me before, could art change the world? I would have said yes, but I would have sort of qualified that and said, well, if your name is Chuck D or Steven Spielberg, those guys reach millions of people. But then I had people standing in line to see a visual artwork by a previously unknown art student in a Midwestern art school, and Congress actually going to the extraordinary measure of outlawing it. And so that sort of set my life on a particular path to try and use art as a real weapon to change the world and highlight some of the big questions confronting humanity. This is not my work. This is a image of a flag that the NAACP, a civil rights organization, used to hang outside of their window in Manhattan, actually near Union Square, the day after anybody was lynched anywhere in the country. From 1920 to 1938, until their landlord forced them to stop doing that. Not that lynching was stopped, but the landlord didn't like to have an organization that was calling for an anti-lynching campaign to be waged. in his office, so in his building, so they forced him to stop. There were over 4,400 documented, and actually now, thanks to the Equal Justice Initiative, there were about 6,600 instances of racial violence, racial terror lynchings that happened from 1865 up to 1965. And so it was very prevalent, but obviously all Black people weren't lynched. But the thing is, the police kill people at a higher rate than at the height of lynching. And so I updated this because it is a conversation that all sort of Black families and Latino families have with their children once they get to about 12 or 13 or 14 years old, is that the police have basically become the inheritors of lynch mob terror. And, you know, we can be killed for any reason or no reason whatsoever by the police. And this is a work which, you know, my work exists in galleries and museums. Sometimes it's on street corners, but I'm happy when it actually goes from sort of an art space. And this is an installation in front of Jack Shaman Gallery in New York, but then it became part of the front page of NewYorkTimes.com. And so it transfers from the art world to the public realm and back into the art world in important ways. Since we're talking about the police, I just want to show a still from an image from a performance I did called Money to Burn, where I burn money on Wall Street, a bill at a time, and encourage those with money to burn to add theirs to the pyre with me. And so I started out with $250 pinned to my chest. I in 5s, 10s, 20s, singles. And ultimately, I ended up burning $171 before about 8 cops stopped me from doing that. They didn't find anything illegal with what I was doing, but they knew there was something tremendously wrong. And so they gave me a summons for disorderly conduct, which they knew actually I was not in violation of the statute. And so this is a still from a project called Slave Rebellion Reenactment. And so it's a community engaged performance that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States. This does not look like a slave revolt, but as I said, it was a community engaged project. And so as part of when you do community engaged work, you actually have to engage the community. And so I wasn't just hiring a bunch of actors. I was actually collaborating with 350 people and more actually to embody freedom and emancipation of this rebellion that happened in 1811 with a mission to overthrow the system of enslavement and set up an African republic in the New World. And so I had to talk with people about what this was, what this history was, why I wanted to do it, and so why we wanted to have people, 350 people marching for 2 days, covering 24 miles on the outskirts of New Orleans. So we had dinners where we talked, we had various meetings with Black student unions at Tulane's campus and a whole other range of things. But this is what the project ended up looking like on the outskirts of New Orleans. This is a badass army of the enslaved in period costume chanting "On to New Orleans, freedom or death, we're gonna end slavery, join us." Enslavers had to get killed at some point, even though mostly this was about freedom and emancipation of the Africans and descendants of African. But, you know, any good slave revolt needs, you know, slave owners to catch a machete. There was musket fire and stuff because in the original that's what happened, so we did that. And one of the important things with my work is that it's not, I use history in a lot of my work, but it's not often about the past. It's also about how the past sets the stage for the present, but how it exists in the present in new form. And so the fact that this was going on next to oil refineries, which have become the thing that was basically sort of killing the people of the region in modern times, it replaced enslavement and sugar slavery at the region. And so this is sort of what I think is the most important picture documenting this work. And just going to show a couple 30-second clips so you can see what it's like. And the image I will end on is a piece that I just did. It's a project called Emancipation Proclamation. It was done just a couple days ago, and part of why I want to show this now is I think this is important for people to think about in terms of national identity, unity, but also as it relates to police and police violence. When I was doing this photograph, my team and I were just out in a non-specific, unimportant area, not very populous area in Brooklyn. And some white guy drove by and stopped his SUV and said, "Hey, I'm calling the cops," and then proceeds to sit there to try and intimidate us and film what we were actually filming. And we fortunately were able to finish what we were doing and leave, but then we had somebody come back just to check, and indeed, lo and behold, there were about 5 or 6 armed policemen looking for some sort of evidence of some performance or something that had happened. And just for clarity's sake, if anybody's questioning, burning an American flag is actually legal. I showed you a work called "What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag" at the beginning of this. That work ended up being outlawed by Congress, and there was much history that got compressed into that, but I and others defied that law on this by burning flags on the steps of the Capitol in 1989. It went to the Supreme Court, and a sort of second Supreme Court flag burning case in 2 years, but part of the legal precedent for that was set by me doing that. And so even though the cops would have known the case law and would have known there was nothing that was illegal there, they came with guns to find some black person who was defying some white guy. So I will stop sharing now, and then we can have a conversation, assuming I can get a mouse to recognize. Oh, come on. There. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dred. Thank you, Shaun. Really incredible, generative, generous, productive work. Think about many decades combined, you've both been on the front lines of kind of radical, critical imagination, reimagining of Blackness and popular imagination. So we'll just get into these questions. So the first sort of rubric is performance art, politics, and protest. So in the last quarter century, Black and brown artists, far too many to list here, have staged radical performance actions in both public and private spaces. In the past few months, the virtual theater, quote unquote, has replaced the, quote, organic theater. The citations come from a 1994 essay by the Critical Art Ensemble titled "The Recombinant Theater and the Performative Matrix." Back to what I was talking about, for example, in his 1997 public performance ATM piece, Pope Bell Sausage linked himself from his waist to a door handle of a corporate bank in Harlem. Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Pina in 1992-93 presented their performance, A Couple in the Cage, Two Amerindians Visit the West. Tanya Bruguera, of course, with Tatlin's Whisper #5 at the Tate Modern in 2008. Robin Road and Tracy Rose in the South African context. Vaginal Davis, the embodiment of a radical performance art practice. Carlos Martil's visceral performance, endurance performances. In Autumn Nights, language-rich performances about race, all kind of constitute a really rich legacy of radical Black performances. So recently, Dred offered a virtual public performance about the COVID-19 and its impact on the African-American community. In the past, as he just said, he recently burned a US flag and US currency, and in 2009 staged a solo performance, still a solo protest performance in Harlem titled "I Am Not a Man." And as we know from Shaun's presentation, following the murder of Eric Gardner, he began a series of performances and a suite of drawings based on that particular incident, which included demonstrations of anti-choking maneuvers. Would you both please talk a little bit about the politics of your performance art and address some questions that I have about audience, which are, who is your audience, real or imaginary? Is in your performances, are you speaking for, speaking with, or speaking on behalf of your respective communities of color?
Oh, so I guess Shaun saying I get to take this. Well, Cliff, that's some great background, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I would love to hear what you all have to say on it. I think this question of, you know, audience and politics is really important. I mean, I do perform in public and I perform in sort of, you know, museum and gallery spaces, and the audiences there are different, but I don't privilege one over the other. When I'm on the streets of Harlem, whoever's on the streets of Harlem is the audience. I mean, we should also talk a little bit about documentation of work and how then that gets into the fine art space in a different way than the live performance. But, you know, when I'm on the streets, it's an audience that, so the performance, I'm Not a Man, I walked from the west side of 125th Street to the east side and back again. It took about an hour total. And 125th Street has the Studio Museum of Harlem in it, very important museum. But the people on the streets often wouldn't go in the museum, even if they were literally on the block as that. And so I want to reach the audience that's in the Studio Museum. I also want to reach the audience that will never go in the Studio Museum. And so I Am Not a Man actually came out of looking at the fact that a lot of people were saying that once Obama was elected, we'd entered some post-racial society. And I grew up in America. I know America. There is nothing post-racial about it. And I thought it was really important to honor and highlight the civil rights struggle that happened that generated the iconic I Am a Man sign that was this sanitation workers in 1968 in Memphis carried, which is still resonant to this day. And a lot of artists, Glenn Ligon, Hank Willis Thomas, Sharon Hayes have all referred to. But also to talk about how, despite all of that demand to be treated like human beings, that this society does not and cannot treat Black people as human beings. And even though Barack Obama was elected president, you know, on his watch, you had Mike Brown, you had Eric Garner, you had all sorts of ways in which this system and society is telling Black people, your life does not matter. It does not count. We will kill you on camera, knowing that we're on camera killing you, and we will get away with that murder. We won't even be indicted. And so this piece was trying to talk about the ways in which Black people were systematically degraded and humiliated and what it means to be Black in America, but also reaching an audience that might be a street audience or street people or homeless people. And in that particular performance, at the end, it just coincidentally had a really substantive, great conversation with some people who spent a lot of time on the streets, and they really engaged what the work was about, and they felt very validated in their capacity to not only understand the work, but that somebody was making work that reflected some of their experience too.
So I want to say that this question of the performance realm is, for me, always a question of audience, always, because it specifically engages the politics of engagement itself. And so the work that you mentioned, I Can't Breathe, Cliff, was intentionally conducted over the course of 4 years because it was conducted in spaces like art institutions and art fairs, as well as schools and housing developments. The approach, the delivery, the care, the intentionality behind it changes with its context. And so my answer regarding perceived and or real community, I want to be very specific about that. My work is always in service of the BIPOC community, who I would contend is my community, the community that I belong to, but it is never speaking for that community. The Black community is not monolithic. And so when my work is placed within these contexts, I'm grappling with whomever is there and how I might engage them in the difficulty of the subject. And so the I Can't Breathe piece is a perfect example in which you had individuals, most often strangers, paired with one another, and then being instructed through a series of self-defense maneuvers. And in that, having to really question their own perceptions of their own subjectivity, but also that of this stranger in which they are placing a chokehold onto. And it's in that space that all of the differences, all of the biases, all the ways in which we see or do not see another person rise to the surface within a matter of seconds. Because when you are forced to, for example, and there are a series of maneuvers that happen in the scope of that performance, but when you are forced to feel the sensation, the weight of that maneuver on your own chest, around your own neck, the compression around your head, but then also forced to act as the aggressor and place that same maneuver and feel that sensation on your arm as you press it against this stranger's neck and chest. You don't look at that footage in the same way. You no longer can consider what you've seen in the killing of Eric Garner in the same way, because that information no longer exists as a headline. It is buried and lodged somewhere else in your body, and that is much more difficult to walk away from.
Thank you both. Going to move on to the next section, the next rubric, quote, filming the police, close quote. So parenthetically, I should say, I'm borrowing this title. I'm borrowing that from a title of a course taught by Salome Aguilera-Skiervyrdsky, professor of media and film studies at the University of Chicago. I should also mention that Skiervyrdsky's new book, The Process Genre, Cinema and the Aesthetic of Labor, which I think most of you would find really very interesting, is available now. But regarding filming the police, in 1990, George Holliday video recorded the Los Angeles Police Department brutally beating Rodney King. That video is one of the earliest and most recognizable moving images of police engaged in inhumane, lawless acts of violence against Black Americans. Diamond Reynolds went live in a video that captured Philando Castile's last breath at the hands of a policeman. For 8 minutes and 43 seconds, passers-by filmed the police lynching of George Floyd as he pleaded for his mother and a drink of water. And before portable camcorders and smartphones, Mamie Till made the murder of her baby Emmett explicit in gruesome black and white photographs staged for the press as a kind of social documentary photograph to raise awareness and galvanize mass action against racism. When citizens film police brutality, murder, and misconduct and make it public, the people rise. They organize, protest, put pressure on elected officials and lawmakers, and demand change. As we know, artists also respond. Many are activists, like Shaun and Dredd, and we march. We also make images and performances in response to those videos and photographs captured by passersby. I have a few questions about this. When artists source footage of police brutality or representations of victims of police brutality to create works of art, does it constitute an iconography of battered and dead Black bodies, or, quote, honorific, close quote, humanizing portraits of brutalized minorities? Do such works of art exploit Black suffering, distress, death, and dying? If so, how so? If not, why not? Or how do these artworks change our perception of Black lives and Black bodies, and to what end? And finally, what is the motivation of artists, the motivation for artists of color to embody or pictorialize both individual and collective American Black trauma?
I'm happy to jump in since this conversation has been swirling around me for weeks now. And I'm going to be as specific as I can be, Cliff, and to everyone listening. To your first question, is it honorific and/or exploitation? I would suggest that question needs to be at the center of debate. And what I would suggest by saying that is that that debate should occur. My feeling is that the work that is often in question is neither nor, or maybe it is both. It is always to be critiqued based on the work and not the original image. And I think that is what is often misconstrued. What people are placing trauma onto is an image and what it invokes in our Black bodies, which is often confused with the work of art. I believe firmly and deeply that we as artists have a role to further interrogate these images. And that what I can do, whether in the capacity of a performance or in my drawing work, is slow down we have to remember one thing, that when these killings are circulating, accompanied by distortion, by noise, by the voices of the media outlet, rarely are we given the space, the time to actually take in these images for what they can offer in these images. And what I feel is that artists have a responsibility to continue to explore, to continue to create rupture in the way we see. For me, it's never a question of if and when we look, it's always a question of how we look. And I'm going to leave you, and I'm sorry to go on a rant because you're catching me in an incredible, emotionally raw state around these kinds of fucking questions. The idea that artists should move aside and allow the media to have the authority of how these images are circulated and how they live in our collective consciousness, I just find that to be so problematic. What is it, we reverse the question, what is it in the George Floyd killing? What is it in that footage that is moving us to action? What is it beyond the collective experience, the collective traumatic experience of COVID that created the fire? What beyond that moved people about that video footage specifically? Ahmaud was killed days before. We had visual evidence of that vigilante killing, and we've had visual evidence in the last many years of other police. What George Floyd specifically? It was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It forced us to bear witness to a life leaving this man's body, the slow execution. And there's a difference in that. There's a way in which we're pulled into differently. And artists have that, have to look and to keep looking. Sorry, Brother Dre.
No, don't, no, thank you. No, I mean, I think, and you've thought a lot about this, and I think it's really important. And I agree with a lot of what you said. And it's sort of the how, not if. And no, I think that, I mean, I have a couple answers. One, for people that don't want to see images of trauma towards Black people, stop the trauma to Black people. You know, it's like, look, if the police weren't kneeling on a man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he dies in front of a camera, then we wouldn't make art about that. We wouldn't march about that. If they didn't hunt a man, Ahmaud Arbery, get their fucking friend to get his cell phone to watch him be hunted, thinking that that was good for their defense, then we wouldn't be making art about that. There wouldn't be art about Philando Castile if Philando Castile was still alive and he wasn't murdered by a cop over a traffic violation. I wouldn't have made A Man Was Lynched by Police Yesterday if it weren't for the killing of Walter Scott on camera. And so I think the main thing is change the damn society. Don't accuse artists of making art about the society. The other thing is, I think that there is context and there is what is the art. I mean, some of the images we're talking about are journalistic images, and some of what we're talking about is art and interpretation. And I think, you know, Mamie Till was profoundly courageous. For her to show an image of her battered son's bloated face and publish it on Life magazine and allow mourners at the funeral for her son to see an open casket took tremendous courage. And it actually changed the course of the civil rights movement. But that was sort of journalism and activism, which is different than artistic interpretation. And I don't denigrate that. I think it's really important and often perhaps more valuable. It's why actually, although I've used a lot of photos of lynching in my work and address that, I've never used that image. I don't know what I could add to it. And it's actually why I don't think the Dana Schutz piece was particularly effective. I don't think I mean, her best shot was to reproduce what Mamie Till did, and she didn't do that. And then there's you know, and so there is the question of what with this traumatic imagery, what do we do? You know, Hale Woodruff did really great woodcuts of lynching that were also, but there were also particular lynching images that he and others did. There's a show that's actually at the Whitney now, which you can't see because of COVID, but that was Mexican muralists and their influence on American artists and a lot of Black artists, but not exclusively. So Charles White and Hale Woodruff and others, but they were all using images of lynching. And some of, I mean, Siqueiros was, Diego Rivera was, Charles White was, Hale Woodruff was. Even I can't think of the really interesting, not Gober, interesting white painter whose name I can't, but they were all using this image because it was the question of the time. Lynching, where you stood on that was where you stood on Black people. And it was important for artists to make work about that. You know, you look at the writing, I mean, Beloved, Toni Morrison's profound novel, it is horrific, some of the things she describes, but it's important for people to recognize what this society is. With that as a background, saying it's really important for artists to look and show and reflect and create a space for all of us to engage that, I also think it is important to use this imagery judiciously. And I had to think about that when I actually had a young son. I had some work that had a lynching photo in it. And when he was 3, my wife said, "You can't have that artwork up." I was like, what do you mean? And I was like, oh, wait, this would be in his daily life, seeing tremendous trauma to Black men, which he would at some point become. So we took down this artwork from our home. And recently I've been thinking a lot about not depicting trauma, but actually depicting liberation and resistance, which is why with Slave Rebellion Reenactment, there was no images of beheaded slaves, broken slaves, beat down slaves, whipped slaves. It was images of formerly enslaved people that had self-liberated and were armed and marching to overthrow the system of enslavement. That was powerful. And so I definitely do not want to limit what artists do. And I really appreciate Shaun's work. I think those drawings are really powerful in inserting the mirror into them. And I wish I'd seen them live. And and stuff. And so I'm not saying, hey, there's something wrong. I think that work is really, really important. But I also think this question of, do we just need to reflect the trauma that we are suffering from in a daily experience, or do we actually also need to show a way out of this nightmare? And I do not think it's an either or. I think it's an and. But I do think there is a question of, how do we re-traumatize people in a society where certainly almost all Black and brown people know that our lives count for nothing, particularly to this government and its armed enforcers. And now, frankly, millions and millions of white people are starting to understand that too.
Well, perhaps it's starting to matter now that white folk are becoming traumatized.
The police treated them just like they treat Black folk. Yes.
Right. But I mean, interesting point about the George Floyd video. I think Shaun's right, and also had resonance because he, in that moment, was humanized. He cried out for his mother. I mean, that's to touch the soul of every human being. He was a human being in that moment, not an abstraction. Okay. Censorship. Like many of us, I remember the war on culture in the 1990s. In 1989, I waited on cue to view the Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition at the Washington Project for the Arts. In 1989, as Dredd recalled, his "What is the proper way to display a US flag" was proscribed by conservative politicians. Robin McCauley's nudity was policed by a former museum director in the artist's performance of Sally's Rape at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1990. The NEA defunded Pope L's Eracism project in 2000. Marlon Riggs' powerful Tongues Untied was gagged by public television in 1991 at the behest of Black conservatives. Following a homophobic panic at the Walker Art Center in 1997, Ron Athey's Four Scenes and a Harsh Life went dark, and the radical feminist performance artist Karen Finley and Holly Hughes were defunded, but certainly not defeated, by white supremacist patriarchs in the US Senate in 1994. Of course, there are many, many other instances of censorship, defunding, and exhibition cancellations. I was going to talk about my expulsion from Rosa de la Cruz's residency in 2011, but that's a long and sad story. Dredd, would you please talk a bit about your experiences of censorship in particular, and what censorship means to freedom in general? You kind of answered this a little bit before, and Shaun, I think now you're ready to talk a little bit about your experience. You weren't this morning, so maybe you could both kind of dip into this question of censorship. Yeah. And I wonder, in fact, if censorship of Black and brown artists, certainly women, is more common and perhaps even more problematic.
Well, I think that, I think typically work that is censored is work that challenges the status quo of whatever country or society. I mean, in China, Ai Weiwei is censored and beaten and almost killed. And so, I think that, if you're an artist that is, queer or a person of color, and you're making work that is reflective of your experience or the experience of your community, or if you're even somebody who's not from one of those places, but actually cares deeply about it and is thinking about what this society means to oppress people, and you make art that's powerful, at times you're going to run afoul of people who want to censor you, be it individuals with no authority but just a loud voice, or be it people in positions of power, be they government or arts funders. And I think that you know, in America, the main way they like to censor you is by ignoring you or saying, you know, not even giving the show in the first place and stuff. But then sometimes they will say, well, all right, we need to show this, and then somebody will complain. And it's like, I think that, you know, I'm looking forward to hearing Shaun talk, because it is so insidious when they try and, when institutions use sort of the community from which the art addresses and is often from as the reason for censoring work they weren't that comfortable talking about in the first, ideas they weren't that comfortable talking about in the first place. And so, you know, my early experience with censorship was, I mean, it was, you know, it was literally outlawed by the US government and criticized by the President of the United States. That was grist for my mill. That was like, look, if the people with the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, cops, and more cops are so threatened by an artwork that they go to the extraordinary measure of outlawing it, then it might be that the emperor really has no clothes, and the art might actually teach people that and allow people to speak on that, and that was really important. When NWA's Fuck the Police was censored, or Ice-T's, you know, Cop Killer was censored, it was because they were shining a light on what this experience was for millions and millions of youth. And this is why I think this work is so vital, that, you know, I mean, this isn't a society that was founded on slavery and genocide and is based on exploitation and oppression. If you make work about that society that looks soberly at it, you're going to shine a light on some oppressive, exploitative relationships. And some people don't like that to be revealed, and they're going to try and stop it either through defunding. I mean, I've had probably at least a dozen shows threatened with censorship, bomb threats phoned into museums, museums closed down for various work, because the work is consistently talking about this country, and that's really important. I talk about other things too and bigger ideas, but the work that has been censored has been in the US, and people who are defenders of this way of life and the status quo have tried to suppress it, be they police unions, mayors, presidents, senators, or random ass people. And so I will just say that it's important to make the kind of work that we all do, and that there needs to be more of it. And right now I see a flowering of interest in the kind of work that we make, and that should be, you know, celebrated, fought for. But I will also say it's complicated. With a man was lynched by police yesterday, there's no US museum that's rushing to show that work, even though it's profoundly relevant, circulating on the internet. I'm getting calls from CNN about, hey, where is this showing? And yet institutions in Europe are showing it. One reached out to me that I had no relationship with, and they said, we want to show this work because we think it's important. And so I think that says a lot about US institutions and the risk they're willing to take, even as they all say Black Lives Matter. They actually don't want to offend certain people. They wish Black lives to matter, but they wish the other lives that mattered more and the money that mattered more to continue to matter more. So over to you, Shaun.
So my position is this, and Cliff, you might remember, as you mentioned over text, reminded me over text, that this is not the first instance in which my work was censored. The first being at PS1 over impressions that my work was overtly violent. And of course, as a young man, I didn't have the tools or the visibility to cause the stir that is occurring right now. But my position is, it has been and will be maintained as this. I spend very little of my energies contending with or defending myself against grievances or interpretations of my work. My position will always be against the gatekeeping power of the institution that determines that risk of the work being shown is grounds for censorship. And as I said earlier, I wish for these institutions to be sites of debate. I welcome the debate. I welcome the difficulty and tensions around the work. What are museums, if not a space for us to have those complex and nuanced conversations that other social spaces do not permit? What are we collectively doing if we are policing each other's creative practices and saying no? But again, the reason that I went public with the cancellation of my show has everything to do with the ways in which an white art institution went through deciding steps and closed up in their own fragility with no input or insight from me, the artist. That is the problem. It requires that art institutions invite, or as I say, call in communities with care, acknowledging the difficulty, acknowledging the tension, acknowledging the trauma, and preparing themselves to hold these audience for that debate. And that is what ultimately the issue is, that these institutions cannot have the conversation because they have not yet addressed their own whiteness and their stakes in the conversation.
Okay, that's deep. This is the last question. So Rachel, what I think we're going to do, what I'd like to do is ask the question, but then we'll open it up to folks in the audience. So it's for Shaun and Dred, but it could be a general question for the audience, and perhaps one of them would like to answer it. In Marlon Riggs' 1995 video, Black is, Black ain't, Bell Hooks says, quote, "We should replace the notion of unity with communion," close quote, because the former suggests that we all must hold the same position, while, quote, communion and its connection to community might give us greater strength and possibility, close quote. I love that quote very much. What is the quote, social responsibility of cultural institutions to people of color? And what responsibilities do people of color have to cultural institutions that presume to serve their best interest? Cultural institutions are generally on the neoliberal spectrum. How do these institutions, which through hiring practices, board memberships, exhibitions and public programs, and collection acquisitions, enable systemic racism? I mean, hiring a few very smart young Black curators is a stopgap. How should institutions be held accountable to make real structural changes? Should museums be defunded? So maybe we can open it up, and one of you can answer, and then we'll open it up with that question. Or maybe one of you like to answer.
Sorry, Cliff, I'm actually seeing a comment that is related to this question. And we'll address it in my response. In terms of, I'm sorry, Cliff, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. And would either one of you like to tackle this question of community and the social responsibility of institutions to communities and communities to institutions? Because I don't think we talk very much about what our responsibilities are to those institutions with whom we invest so much power and influence over our lives, our representation, etc. And I'm also thinking about other kinds of community, institutional structures and community, pedagogical structures. Having not been hired again for a full-time teaching position after 20 years of teaching at an elite private school in upstate New York. Institutional racism, the pedagogical level for us is real. I know this in 20 years of teaching. And certainly you all can speak to that in terms of you having dealt with communities so often, Dred, certainly, and now your thing with MoCA, Shaun. So I'm talking too much and I'd like to stop talking. So maybe somebody else can take this.
So, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, I think that the vision you're putting out of museums actually having, well, first off, of the not going for unity but communion, I think is really important, actually. I mean, and the easiest way to say that is like Ben Carson. I mean, it's like, he's black, but he don't think like me. He don't think like anybody in this room, the virtual room. And so if we're trying to go for unity, I don't think he and I ain't going to come to terms. We're just in different spaces, and I'm cool with that. But having communion where there is wrangling over ideas is important. The question of how art spaces serve that, and as Shaun was saying, what if MoCA was in a position to hold community and have actual substantive engaged conversation, both with him, but also with a broader community? I think that would be great. And I hope that some museums do the work to be able to do that. But that's actually difficult. There are a lot of artists who've been doing that. I mean, Shaun's one of those artists. There are a lot of artists who've been doing substantive engaged work on difficult questions and building space to hold those conversations and hold difference and actually enable people to talk that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be in the same room or express their concerns. But that's not what museums historically have done. And institutions, be they museums, be they art funders, be they political bodies, governments, whatever, they don't like to change. They're generally content with what they are. And particularly with museums, as you said, they're neoliberal. They like to think, hey, we're all cool. We're the good guys. We all agree. And then suddenly they found out in the past week, well, wait a minute, we don't all agree on everything. Hold up for a minute. But I think, I do hold out hope that if these institutions are genuine, there can be change. And, unlike, say, the NFL, which says, hey, we screwed up, we should have recognized the importance of protest. It's like, look, all you got to do is hire one guy, and then we can have a conversation. But until you hire that one guy, until Colin Kaepernick has a job, all that you're saying is bullshit. When Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, says, hey, Black Lives Matter, it's like, well, if that was the case, if you just had that revelation, why the hell didn't you loan money to black people through the PPP program and instead we're loaning it to Shake Shack? For those people, that's bullshit. But I do think for the people at the curators and senior leadership at the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the SF MoMA, whatever, I think generally speaking, they want to be on the right side of history and would be open to change. But it's also not going to be easy because it is going to be change, including, part of the elephant in the room is funding. When they're relying on philanthropy and the good graces of people, say like Warren Kanders, a person who sells weapons to war criminals, that conversation might not go the same as if you don't have that man on your board that's the chair of your board. And so that is part of what's bound up in this. But yeah.
Here's an interesting question. I don't know if we should read the person's name, but here's a question or statement and a question. Institutions and museums have been mentioned many times. I would add to this curators, not that individual curators are the same as institutions, but connected. How can institutions and curators be allies, all caps, in facilitating the work you're doing?
And so I'm going to combine this with your former question, Cliff. This is a question of power. And what Dredd is pointing to and what other people are pointing to in their questions is the ways in which money infiltrates decision and how power is really contained and sequestered. The fact that power is not distributed. This is a question of every capitalist system of which museums are part of. And so, but the other part of the question is it our responsibility as Black artists who have gained spaces within these institutions to disrupt and make change? And that is a complicated question because I can make demands that cater to my practice. So with every major institutional exhibition in the last few years, I can make demands that I have encounters with security and visitor services and the executive offices and PR and marketing, which I do because I know how to treat my work and how to hold people as audience members in my practice. But I have a hard time saying then that I am responsibility for creating space for sustainable change within a white institution. That responsibility is their own. I can create the models for change. I can initiate that rupture, but ultimately that shouldn't fall on the Black and brown artists. Because what we've seen is that we are then propped up as the voice for an external community that the museum wants to invite in as a disguise for the internal labor that actually needs to happen.
But also, I want to say a couple. I mean, first, that's a really good point. I mean, like Toni Morrison, I'm going to bastardize it, but she said, white people have a very serious problem about racism, and they should start working on that and leave me out of it. And it was one of these things. It's like, look, you know, the question of racism is like, y'all got some work to do. You got to solve some stuff. And I think that's important. But also when you say, look, you can go to a museum and make certain demands to meet with people, that's true, but it's still a fucking cover. When they do a Jeff Koons show, and I'm just beating up on Koons because he's like, you know, the prototypical, hey, I paint shit and I get paid a ton of money for it. I don't particularly hate his work more than other art. Well, okay, I do, but that's a different question. But you know, it's like, but as the thing is, when a museum does a Jeff Koons show, they're spending hell a lot of money to ship the work, to insure the work, to write a catalog about the work, to have curators spend a lot of time researching the work, to bring him in to possibly do it. They're whining and dining collectors to buy the work. And all of that is way disproportionate to the amount of time, money that is spent on you, even if they're paying you a decent commission. And it's not, I mean, so they're even within what you do, the labor that you provide for transforming that institution and doing your work is not compensated the way the rest of the art world compensates the people who really make the decisions in the art world and who it actually serves.
Thank you very much, Dred.
You're welcome.
I just want to jump in for 1 second, and we've got quite a few questions on the monuments issue, and I thought it might be good to address some of those. One person asks specifically whether the toppling of the monuments itself is a performance in your view.
If done right. I think, I think, you know, as an artist whose work crosses lines between art and political action and protest, it's sometimes hard to tell what is what, but I don't think it's especially productive to say that anything that, say, activists do is performance. We might think of it as performative, and I think a lot of activists are learning from strategies of using the media and using imagery the way artists do. But I think mostly they're trying to tear down some racist monuments, and that's a really good thing. And I don't think it buys us much to say, oh, actually this is like performance, so we can understand it and we'll embrace it and it's better. It's like, no, some people just knocked some shit down and that was really good, and sent Columbus for a swim and sent enslavers for a swim and tried to melt them down and knock people off horses. And suddenly, all of a sudden, this question of you know, why is it that enslavers and traders and all these other people are the monuments all over the United States? Whereas, say, in Germany, after Germany lost the war, they blew up swastikas. There's no monuments to Hitler and Goring and Goebbels and that. And they've done a fine job of teaching that the history of fascism without having to promote fascism through monuments. And so I don't think the activists are performance artists, but I think what they're doing is right on and knock them all down and melt them down and blow them up and get them out of here.
I mean, certainly the connection I think this person's trying to make is that perhaps, you know, the sort of spectacle of a street activity, of a street action, and that a lot of activists, as Dred has pointed out, are very good at the spectacle. You know, the immigrant woman who climbed the that was extraordinary. You know, I mean, to create that kind of spectacle that has a greater consequence, say, than Matthew Barney in drawing restraint or any other endurance-based performance artist. That something was accomplished in my opinion, much more important than an art experience. A kind of political transformation happened with that action, out of that action, out of that gesture. But I think this notion of acting out in public as resistance is maybe something we should all be doing, performance artists or not, act out in public.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and her name is Patricia Okwomu, if I'm saying it correctly. And I would just want to relate to everything you said. I also felt the same of Colin Kaepernick's taking the knee as a performative gesture, incredibly effective in stirring the necessary conversation. But it's a different deed, it's a different work than an artist must do. And so when the heat dies, what is the longer narrative work that must continue to happen? And I think that is uniquely situated in the artist's wheelhouse, because when those monuments disappear, there is no justice in a continued reckoning with the history, as Dred said, of why those were monuments in the first place, and implicating white citizens in those geographies of upholding those monuments. And so the longer narrative work, the longer narrative revision, the longer narrative implications are the sustained work that artists must do.
Rachel, you've been like looking at the Q&A questions and stuff. Are there some other good ones that we should be getting into?
Right here, I'm on mute. Yes, there's a lot of great questions here. I think one, we've got actually a question for you, Dred, about a man was lynched by police yesterday. Someone, Lang Brown here, is asking whether the meaning of that has changed for you over these 5 years with this president, or is it the same, or is it even more relevant in these difficult times?
Well, I mean, I think what's changed is that it is, I mean, when I made the work, I made it very quickly in response to the murder of Walter Scott, who was murdered over a broken taillight. I thought that it was a piece that was good, but I frankly didn't think it would be something that would be an important work of mine or that people would find tremendously important. And the first show that it was in, it was in a small place in Des Moines, Iowa, and you know, the show was a good show, but nobody really cared about it all that much. It was only when it was shown outside of Jack Shainman Gallery after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed in 2 separate incidents by the police. A year later, within 36 hours, they were killed with each other, and then people were sort of furious, and Black Lives Matter was at a higher level of protest. And then now it's been circulating on Twitter and Instagram and published in Vogue and National Geographic and the Smithsonian. And yeah, it's taken on a life, which I didn't expect. So it's changed in that sense, that it really, in a weird way, has become part of a sort of civil rights and social justice thing. It's kind of gone from the art space into a public space, which I think is great. But while I do think that this president, Trump, is a fascist and is really remaking America on a fascist foundation, it's not like, and a particular hallmark of the fascism in that he embodies is racism. I mean, it just straight up contempt and hatred of Black people, and unvarnished with, you know. But I think that it would be, people are living in an illusion if they thought that, say, under Barack Obama, the police treated Black people well. I mean, you know, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, you know, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray. We could list more. You know, John Crawford, Sandra Bland. That all was under Obama. You know, and so, and particularly with Mike Brown, when he was killed, Obama told the protesters, now chill this shit out and let the Justice Department do its work. He was basically, stop your protesting, while the protesters were being shot and gassed and maced and bludgeoned by the cops in Ferguson. And Obama was like, no, we got this. It's all cool. And so I think that yes, Trump has a particular way in which his racism ratchets things up and is giving the police more license to do what their job actually is, and that is to brutalize and oppress people and enforce relations of exploitation and oppression. But I don't think that I think the artwork is what it is, and it is reflective of the society, for the past 200 years or more. I mean, and I say 200, trying to place it more once the police were the modern police force that we have, as opposed to going back to 400 years where it was more slave patrols and white supremacy was sort of enforced in a different way under a different economic system. But, the past 150, 200 years where the police have been sort of like the modern day police, that this work would have stood, and particularly since, the end of the overthrow of enslavement, and so I think that, it's a piece particularly of modern times, but it is just as relevant 20 years ago as now. And I look forward to the day when it is not relevant at all and is just in a history museum as opposed to an art museum.
And we have another one here. Nicole Awai says, the policeman who murdered George Floyd was aware he was being filmed.
Yeah.
What do you think he was performing for his audience, reasserting his power and his perceived superiority?
Just unvarnished, we can kill you. We're the cops. We're going to get away with this murder. And I mean, it's like, they knew about Eric Garner and they were like, oh, we can one up that. We in front of a crowd of people pleading for this man's life, knowing that they're being filmed, they're like, this is what we do. None of y'all can do shit about it. And I think that it was just powerfully asserting the role of the police and the role of white supremacy and the role of individual white murdering cops. And fortunately, the people have said, not this time. We are not going to allow this George Floyd to be just one in another long list of dead Black people killed at the hands of the police. We're going to fight on this. And we're in the opening chapters of that battle, and I really hope that the people fight it through to the end.
I mean, I think the performance of that lynching, of that murder, could be maybe applied to Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life, and could be kind of analyzed as a kind of performance of police power. The arrogant, this motherfucker had his hand in his pocket. And you're right, Nicole, that awareness of being watched, they're without compunction. So perhaps we have to retrain. We know that police officers are horrible performers, that they don't perform their role well. And I think that's where we are with the efforts following Floyd's lynching to kind of reform and rethink and reimagine how the cops perform. And again, I think it goes back to that notion of even cops should think of what love looks like in public. Sounds silly, I know, but
kind of a related question with the video, this is from Zoe Hopkins, with the videos of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. I've been thinking a lot about the way the white gaze observes these killings. I find myself in a space of discomfort when I imagine the way white people and the white media watches and scrutinizes Black death as a spectacle. Earlier, you were discussing filming the police, and you discussed a critical problem the artist faces. Question of whether the creation of images engaging Black death exploits trauma or builds power. But what about the audience? How does the gaze, particularly the white gaze, reproduce the violences and traumas embedded in anti-Blackness and its aesthetics?
Okay, sorry, am I back?
Yeah, we see you.
Did you hear that question, Shaun? Can you answer it?
Yes, I heard the tirade. Can we stay on Nicole's question for a moment?
Sure.
Because I would love to contribute to that specifically because of my experience working with officers. And I think it's important for us to also see what's evidenced in Officer Derek Chauvin's body. I mean, I also think it's important to state his name because in our collective memory, we always forget the officers' names. And that ultimately, as history progresses, gives those officers a pass. So I try with diligence and I try with effort to always state that name. But I think what's also important, in agreement with everything that everyone has said, is to mention what is being expressed in the nonchalance of Derek Chauvin's body, the way in which he internalized his power, has internalized racism, and therefore paid
I think we lost Shaun.
It looks like
I'm
he's
sorry,
back.
my internet decided to stop.
I mean, I think, I mean, were you finished or did you want to continue? I mean,
Go ahead,
Shaun?
go ahead.
Yeah. I think part of the thing, and I mean, this is perhaps where Shaun, you and I might have a bit of difference. I don't know. But in terms of, I think the police are actually, I mean, well, I don't, they're doing their job. I don't think that Derek Chauvin was a anomaly. I think that the fact that the other three cops were around him thought this was perfectly normal. This was just a day's work. And the fact that the cops who, in Atlanta, who killed Rayshad Brown, were when he was fired, the other cops actually had a sick out. They were like, look, if we can't do our job, we don't want to do this. And our job includes shooting somebody in the back that's running away. That's our job. Why do you people get upset when we do our job? That's what you asked us to do. And I think the society needs to grapple with, well, is that the job you want done? And I think there are a lot of people who might not know that they actually answered yes to that. And I think there are other people who, when they confront with what that job is, they might say, well, no, we got to change. But then that's going to take a tremendous struggle because that is the job of the cops. The cops know this. And I think that, we wouldn't say, well, okay, if we were meeting with SS officers in 1939 or 38, or 41, well, you just killed some Jews and you were completely heartless about it. You sent some people into the gas chamber. What were you thinking? You were just completely it was just like another day's of work. And they were like, well, yeah, that's my job. That's what I do. The society is licensed and authorized me to do that. If this were in the Belgian Congo, and people were butchering, or if this were, in early America in 1820, and the cavalry was massacring and raping Indians and setting their villages on fire. And you question, well, why did you do that? That seemed inhuman. You're like, what are you talking about? This is my job. This is what this society asked me to do. It's you who don't understand what my job is. And, I just think that the society needs to really confront what this society is and what the role of the police is. For those of you who actually believe, that Officer Friendly was, chasing after dangerous criminals and protecting an otherwise perfectly functioning society, that's a problem with your understanding, because that's not what the cops are. It's not what they do. And if you even just look at the amount of time they spend doing anything, there's a recent report that literally 1% of their job is actually doing anything about violence amongst the people. The rest of it is traffic tickets, arguments amongst, family disputes that's not even rising to the level of violence, a man brutalizing a woman. It's, just all sorts of petty stuff and paperwork. But the thing is, but they do enthusiastically get trained to walk around with a gun wherever they go, and they brutalize people. You don't get a situation I mean, if it was just one anomaly of like, one person choking George Floyd to death and three other cops thought there was something wrong with that, they would have stopped him. They didn't see anything wrong with that. And no other cop would have. None of the cops around when Eric Garner was killed saw anything wrong with what was being done. None of them stopped him. That was another choking that took time. And so, yeah.
We have to remember that Danny Pantaleo, the officer that applied
killed Eric Garner,
said his first remarks was, "I was doing my job.
Yeah.
I never meant to hurt someone. I was doing my job." So the question has to always be, how are these systems enabling, or I should say, corrupting an individual to such an extent that Derek Chauvin does not see George Floyd as human? How are these systems enabling internalized racism to be constructed with power? And then we also have to ask, as white viewers, when seeing that footage, are they on any level implicating themselves by seeing themselves in the body of Derek Chauvin?
I think you both make really interesting points. And I mean, I see where you're coming from, Dred, with respect to the cops are just doing their job. It has me thinking lately that I think perhaps we need to defund prosecutors, because cops make arrests. That is what cops do. They make arrests, and prosecutors put Black people in jail. And cops want to make arrests to satisfy prosecutors and to get promotions. So the goal is arresting Black people so the prosecutors can get reelected. So I feel like, this movement is really two-pronged. It shouldn't just be cops doing their jobs poorly. It should also be prosecutors doing their job poorly and abusing their prosecutorial powers, right? Which is, of course, why I'm excited Klobuchar withdrew. And I hope that Kamala Harris withdraws as well, because we don't need another top in the White House. I mean, as you mentioned before, I think that's one of the systemic things that we also have to address. The prison industrial complex has created a kind of mythic Black man, a mythic Black creature. We got to get rid of the prisons. And then the cops don't have to police the way the cops are policing, because the prosecutors are making better decisions and respecting Black lives as well.
Well, Cliff, I'll one-up you. I think we got to get rid of America. I think that, I'm being flippant, but I'm also being serious. I don't think you can get towards anything that resembles a just society, one that the three of us, but also most of the people listening to us, would think is a just society, as long as you have America being what it is. The prison system, the prosecutors, the cops, the judges, the laws, all of that, none of that's accidental. None of it's accidental. No one individual legislator thought, oh, I'm going to write this one law that will lead to all this massive prison industrial complex. No one cop said, I'm going to execute my authority this one particular way. No one prosecutor said, I'm going to do this and lead to 2.3 million people in prison, 1.1 million of which are Black. But they all knew they were part of it. And they all consciously and willingly were part of it. You couldn't, with what we know now, we couldn't imagine getting to a just society in America in 1830 if you didn't get rid of slavery. Nobody would say that. It actually took a war to get rid of slavery. It was something that actually had to be militarily settled. And in fact, the enslaved had to rise up as part of that war to overthrow a system of enslavement. And I think that as long as America, which was founded on slavery and genocide, and is right now sending battalions of cops to tear gas, mace, bludgeon, beat with shields, brutalize journalists, brutalize Black people, brutalize brown people, brutalize white kids to defend the murder of George Floyd, I don't think they're suddenly going to say, oh, gee, our bad, we made a mistake. We're going to close down the prisons. We're going to rewrite the laws. We're going to kick out the judges. We're going to make the press. You need to defund all of that, but that's not going to happen unless you get rid of this society and imagine a radically different and far better society.
So let me add that in my an experience of working and dealing directly with the court system, I've never met one officer, I've never met one judge, I've never met one prosecutor that felt that they were a bad person. And so the question is, again, and I'm seeing comments about moving beyond this narrative of bad apple, remove that. The question must always be, how do these systems enable the machinery to just so easily remove humanity? Because going back to the earlier point, these individuals working within that machinery believe that they are doing their job justly. And so that is what the philosophy and principle of abolition shows us, that we have to see ourselves outside of the system in order to work toward a vision of justice.
Well, my dear, dear brothers, I hope that I know that you are still doing the work as artists. And this was a really terrific conversation. We've been on for 1 hour and 40 minutes. My goodness, still have 269 people holding on to your dear words.
They got nothing better to do than watch the artists talk. Damn, man, these are some pathetic people.
we all have so much work ahead of us, and I hope that this conversation will generate other conversations, and that ArtNet and other publications will start to do more programming, more publications, more writing, more editorials about it. The art world matters too. Black Lives Matters. Would you all agree? So anyway, thank you. Is that okay to end now, Rachel? Or
yeah, I think that's great. And I just want to remind people that we will have this recording available on ArtNet News, and potentially in the transcription also in some form. We'll figure that out. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Cliff, Dred, and Shaun. This was so fascinating. I'm so happy.
Thank you, dear Dred. Thank you, dear Shaun.
Well, thank you, Cliff, for organizing this and having us on. This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Cliff. An honor and pleasure.
You're so welcome. Okie dokie. It's weird to say goodbye on these things. How do you say goodbye?
Like this.
One love, brothers.
One love.
One love.
Love. Much love, brothers.
Much love.